Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well, the show where we talk about well-being weekly. Each week we have a very different topic, and this week we have a very big one. The topic of the day is the orgasm gap, causes and personal and societal solutions. And today in the virtual studio, I have with me Dr. Laurie Mintz, who is the expert in this area. She's super passionate about what she does. So I'll let her introduce herself to you in a little bit. But to start with, in case you wonder who she is an author, therapist, and professor whose life's work has been committed to helping people live more authentic, meaningful, joyful, and sexually satisfied lives through the art and science of psychology. It's such a wonderful work that she's doing. And I think we don't talk about this topic enough. In fact, in a lot of locations, countries, and continents, this is probably very taboo. So I'm excited to talk to Dr. Laurie about this topic today. Thank you so much for joining us, Laurie. How are you today?
I am great. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So please tell us a bit more about yourself. Your life's work is dedicated to this area. There's got to be a reason why. I love hearing the reason why, our guests do the things that they are doing.
Yeah. So I am a licensed psychologist. So I see clients in private practice. I'm a certified sex therapist. And I'm a professor at the University of Florida, where I teach the psychology of human sexuality to hundreds of students a year. I'm also the author of 2 books, both aimed at empowering women sexually: A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex, and the book we're going to focus on a little bit today because it's about the orgasm gap, Becoming Cliterate, Why Orgasm Equality Matters and How to Get It. I was also really honored to do a TED Talk on this same topic. So, to answer your question, how did I get so passionate about this topic and about empowering women sexually in general? The brief story is I got my Ph.D. as a psychologist way back in 1987, started teaching, working with clients. And what I realized at some point is, because I was very comfortable with the topic of sex, I would ask my clients, any issues in this area? And about 8 out of 10 times, the client would say, yes, but had you not asked, I wouldn't have told you. And then I realized, wait, I'm asking clients this, but to be really frank, I'd had almost no training on this in graduate school. Psychologists, physicians, we're dealing with people's lives, and we don't get training in sexuality. And it just dawned on me, like, oh my gosh, this is really a problem. So I did a really deep dive into that area, and I immersed myself in it. I ended up writing my first book, ended up teaching a graduate seminar in sex therapy. And actually, after my first book came out, I had a little panic. Like, the scientist in me said, what if I have produced something that's not useful to the world, even though I based it in science, a translation of science? So I then discovered, wow, there's a whole area of the efficacy of self-help. So I had some students run a clinical trial on my book, several, found out it was useful, helped women. Long story short, then everything I started doing became about sex. I got a job at the University of Florida, moved from Missouri, where I'd been for 21 years, mostly to teach this class that hadn't been taught. And it was in that class that I became passionate about the orgasm gap. It was my students' experiences, their pain around lack of orgasm and the orgasm gap. that had me start teaching to that topic. And I would get notes from my students like, thanks to your class, I'm orgasmic. Thanks to your class, I don't feel broken anymore. And that's when I thought, this needs to go way beyond my classroom. We need to really draw attention to and close the cultural orgasm gap and empower women for sexual pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think when you said you asked if you hadn't asked your clients, they wouldn't have told you. I think that is just so true because I think a lot of people are afraid to talk about this topic. And, whenever I find a group of girls talking about this topic, I feel so empowered because, it's so important to address the issues. And we don't talk about this enough. And we'll go into the topic very soon. I'm very excited to talk to you about this because I know you're the expert. I'm curious to learn more about this, especially since, the orgasm gap is such I think it's probably a new notion to a lot of people, such a new thing. A lot of people don't think about this at all. So we'll address a lot of things related to it. We'll talk about how it's related to well-being. But before we do that, let's get to know you a bit better. We have a section called Have You Met Dr. Laurie Mintz? And here we're going to get some of your recommendations. This is my favorite part because I get recommendations from my guest. The first thing I always ask is, what is a book you would recommend?
And a book that I would recommend, of course, beyond my own, is honestly, it's a book. It's not well known actually at all. It's Sizzling Sex by Michael Castleman. And the reason I recommend that book is he's a great writer and he takes a lot of the science and he makes it very accessible. And what I love about this book is it's written for men, but it's very like it's because to close the orgasm gap, we need women and men. But he writes in such a way that is so science based and so supportive of equality and compassion and equal relationships. So I really love that book, even though it's not very well known. It's one of my favorites.
Oh, that is interesting. I've never heard about that before. So thank you. Second one, what is a movie you would recommend?
A movie that I would recommend that I really love is A Beautiful Life. And now that's one most people have probably heard of, but I think that's just an absolutely beautiful, beautiful movie.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's always good to go back to the classics. And next one, you're on the podcast as a guest now, but which podcast would you recommend to our listeners?
Um, we do hard things. I love that podcast. We can do hard things.
Wonderful. Taking notes on my list so I can have that and listen to it later. Um, Next question, who is your famous role model? Or if not a famous person, then who is your personal role model?
Oh, well, I am going to go back to also a woman that people might not have heard of, who would actually have two, and they're very related. But if I have to stick with one, I am going to say Cher Height. Cher Height wrote in the 1970s the Height Report, which was the first book, the first study that pretty much exposed the fact that women were having bad sex and that most women didn't orgasm from intercourse and that women were faking and why it was revolutionary. But what really I want to bring attention to is that she persevered with this message despite the hate she received. Playboy called it the hate report. She received so much hate mail that she actually had to leave the country and go in hiding. And I don't think enough people know about her story. And I don't think enough people know about how she persevered to get an important message out there, which I am still trying to continue in her legacy. Thankfully, things have changed enough that I wasn't run out of the country for it. But I would say that she is a role model. And if I can sneak in another, it would be also the late Betty Dodson. who did very, very similar work in empowering women sexually. And she wrote the book Sex for One. She was one of the first people to really bring women's masturbation out of the closet, if you will, into the light. And both of them passed away within the last few years.
Yeah. Very sad that we lose them, but yeah, glad to hear more about their legacy. I actually haven't heard about them before, so thank you for sharing about their great work. And it's really related to the topic of the day. So I guess in a way we can do more research and even look up the things that you mentioned in this episode to learn more about women's sexual empowerment, the orgasm gap, and beyond. Last question in this part: what is a course you completed that left a really big impact on you?
A course that really, really impacted me has nothing to do with sex. It was in graduate school, a course called Existential Psychotherapy. And it was based on the work of Irving Yalom, who basically said much of the things we don't talk about, but that are core to all human beings that we need to grapple with in order to be well, in order to live good lives, are many things we don't talk about, like our own mortality, facing death. How does it feel to be alone, aloneness? How do we get meaning in life? And so he talked about these core concepts that are cut across humans that that are very, very impactful to our sense of self, our sense of community, and our well-being.
Yeah. Wow. What an interesting course. Now I want to do it. I want to take
The
that
book
too. Yeah.
the book is still out there. It's called Existential Therapy.
Yeah.
It's very thick, but it's a powerful read. He's got
Yeah.
other books too, but
Yeah.
that's the core. But
Mm.
I was a young person at the time, and I hadn't thought of those concepts. Like, how does my own, certainly now as I age, I think about this course more and more, right? But how does my own awareness of my own mortality affect my day-to-day life? How do I create meaning in my life, and you read my intro, which was about creating meaning in my
Yeah.
life. How do I grapple with being alone? How do we all grapple with being alone? So I think they're big, big topics, and it was very impactful for me as a young person to start to grapple with those topics.
Yeah, I really love that because that is a question that I've been asking people around me quite a bit, and I know it has nothing to do with today's topic, but I think it's actually part of our well-being, right? When we talk about meaning and like finding out what we do in our lives, so tightly related to well-being.
It's integrally related to well-being.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of which, now let's talk about our topic and let's talk about well-being. We briefly touched on, the course that you took that really impacted you and how it's kind of, part of our well-being. But I wonder what you would personally define well-being as a concept.
I think well-being is so multifaceted. I would define it as both in the mind body, both the mind and the body must be involved for there to be well-being. And I don't separate them. I do think there's a massive connection, but so I'm not saying one has to be healthy to have well-being, or that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that to be well is to be aware, to be as content and self-aware of one's circumstances as possible, to feel good in the world, even, and to feel, for some people it may be a sense of purpose, meaning. I think it's very subjective. For others it might be, I don't have great meaning in life, say maybe work wise, but I have great connections with others. So it really is feeling a sense of wellness. And I'm obviously that, but I don't want to define it with itself, but it's a feeling of contentment and and a good attitude about one's life circumstances. And it reminds me, if let me, I can define this with an example, if I might. Would that be okay?
Yeah, definitely.
I spoke on the phone last night to someone who was like an aunt to me my whole life. And she's in her late 80s. She's lost her husband. Um, she recently had a great tragedy. She lost a child, which is, an adult child, which I think is one of the worst things that can happen to someone. And so I called her to see, how are you doing? And she said, Laurie, I have bad days. I have very bad days. Some days I miss, she talked about her son so much. And I wonder, like, why am I still here if he's gone? She said, but then I think to myself, I have other children. I have grandchildren. I have great grandchildren. I've lived a great life and I'm still living a good life. I'm taking a meditation class this week. I've gotten into chair yoga. Yes, I just moved into an apartment and it's really small because and it's in a, community for elderly individuals. She said, so, you know, I've had tragedy, I've had pain. She said, but I'm doing well. So it's, to me, wellness then isn't about, she doesn't feel that good physically. She's had tragedy, but wellness is about her. She's aware of who she is and what she's been through, and she's continuing to work on herself and her attitude. So I would say she exhibits well-being, even though someone might look at her, right, with her walker and her tragedies that just happened and think she's not. So I think well-being comes from within and what we do with our life and our circumstances. And it's so much about our attitude. Sorry if that
Yeah.
was long winded, but
No,
I
not at
think that
all.
captures it for me.
Yeah, no, I really love it because what you talked about covers so many different facets of our lives, and a part of being on this show for me is being really vulnerable and talking about my own experiences. And I think having a sense of well-being doesn't mean that you feel great all the time. And I totally agree with you. Things might happen in our lives. The person that you just talked about has something really tough happen to her. At the same time, each of us in our lives might have our own challenges. Like I talked to my friend who's really young, and her challenge at the moment is feeling overwhelmed because she doesn't know where to start. And she used to be really good academically, and now she's struggling. And to her, it's like, she had a breakdown one day, but then the next few days, she worked through that and she felt okay again. And she appreciated what she had because she did say, I have a great life. My parents are great. My parents are caring. They support my education. They sent me here. They pay for everything. And I don't have to worry about money. The only problem I have now is just underperforming academically. And I hear people's problems and I start to take them on and, like kind of feel the emotions. And that's why I got overwhelmed. But then a few days later, she said, I've processed it. I think it's okay. It's all good now. It was just that
Yeah.
moment. So,
Yeah.
it's so interesting to hear.
She had the perspective, she had the resilience.
Yeah.
And I think what helped, I don't know if this is true of your friend, but I think what often helps with wellness is letting oneself actually feel those feelings,
Yeah.
but to really go there, to release them,
Yeah.
to not hold back the feelings and think we can't have them. We can't
Yeah.
feel angry, we can't feel sad, we can't feel overwhelmed like your friend.
Yeah.
What we often avoid is what gets us. And
Yeah.
so I love that your friend
Totally.
said, I feel lousy today. And that helped her feel
Yeah.
better the next day.
Yeah. Totally. And yeah, and another thing, because we're going to address some misconceptions, I'm just going to say I totally agree with that. A lot of the times we try to hide these things because it's not pretty. And we need to be strong. We need to show that we are strong, or it's life is great to others. I haven't done that. I just been really honest with everyone around me. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on, but personally, something's wrong. And this is tying straight back to what you said earlier about meaning and the course that really impacted you. Because I have been really burnt out. I've talked about this on this show for quite some time. And burnout here is not just because of work, but because of life, because of a lot of things. And I don't feel the joy in anything anymore. For a really long time, I just struggled to find out what I love. And, like I love the work that I do and I started for a reason, but somewhere along the way, I just kind of lost sight of what I'm doing. So I'm enjoying this conversation with you. I'm loving what we're talking about today. And in this moment is great, but I cannot guarantee that I walk out of this room feeling the same energy that I'm going to feel right now because it's, part of recovery. So I'm allowing myself to feel whatever it is that I'm feeling, maybe a little meh, but it'll be okay. And just prioritizing rest, it's so important to allow myself to be okay with not being okay and just enjoy doing whatever I feel like doing and just take the time to relax.
Yeah, I'm really honored that you shared that with me. And I'm really glad that you're like acknowledging your burnout and facing it and allowing yourself to rest. Because so many times, I think people in general, and, I think high achieving women in specific, there's even a book by Emily Nagoski called Burnout. I don't know
Yes,
if
I
you've ever.
love that book.
Yes. Okay.
Uh,
So,
love it.
yeah, and she's very wise. And I think a lot of times we don't take the time to rest. We just push through. And it's really, really important that we take the time to rest, to talk about our feelings, to honor our feelings as well. And so I'm really sorry that you're feeling that way, but I do wish you like, you know, recovery
Thank
time.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Me too. I hope so too. It's going to take some time. I know that because I've done some research and I think it takes roughly 6 months to a year for you to fully recover from it. And so I think the key for me right now is just to understand that I should not add more stress to my life because I have this productivity anxiety where I'm like, I need to do more. Why am I not doing more? People are doing so much. I used to do so much. But I'm like, no, Lu, calm down. It's fine. This season in your life is called rest and relax and just recharge. Find out what you love again. It's fine. Don't do anything.
Yeah. Let me share something with you. A supervisor once shared with me that really impacted me.
Yeah.
He said, um, we're called human beings, not human doings.
Yeah.
And maybe you've heard that before, but it really struck me. And he said, like, there's a teeter-totter, right?
Mm.
Like of being and doing. And
Yeah.
he said to me, you're way out of whack, Laurie. Your doing is way up here. It's way out of whack. You're not being enough, and you have to get back to equilibrium. And I've had periods of my life where I was burned out, times where I honored it and times where I just tried to push through.
Mm.
And I tell you, the pushing through made it a lot worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions about well-being, I think. It's like you have to work on it hard to be well, but sometimes no. It's actually the complete opposite. And I think that's, to me, it's like one of the biggest misconceptions because of what I've noticed so far. But I wonder what you think to be some of the biggest misconceptions about well-being, maybe something that we haven't addressed yet.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest conceptions of well being is that it's, it is, it is a constant state of happiness that I think most people, which is why I answered the way I did, that well being means I'm happy, I'm healthy, physically and mentally, and I think well being isn't necessarily, you can be well. Like, honestly, sitting here talking to you, you're telling me you're burned out, and I would see you as a well person.
Yeah.
Why? Because you're aware of it,
Yeah.
you're honoring it, you're resting. So I think that's a big misconception about well-being. And I think you got to the other one too, that well-being means doing. I'm gonna be productive, and I'm gonna exercise, and I'm gonna do this, that, the other. And sometimes well-being means being in stillness. sometimes well-being means not producing, not fighting through. I mean, I cannot argue with the fact that well-being is absolutely enhanced by things like 8 hours or 8 hours of sleep a night, by physical exercise, by meditation. But I have seen some people work so hard on well-being that they make it another chore.
Wow, that hits really hard. That is such a great point. I don't know what to say, but I just have to kind of take that all in because it hits me really hard. That was like literally me last year, which is why I burnt out because I was like, let's do this and that and here, go there, do more, and just like, take on everything. And guess what? It did not help.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry you went through that, and I'm so glad that you honored that.
Thank
Yeah.
you. It's something that I have to learn, and I think we all go through that. And I'm so passionate about well-being. I can talk about this topic for a long, long time, but I know we're not here to talk about just well-being because we're here to talk about the orgasm gap. So let's head there. And I'm excited to learn about this topic from you because I'll be real, I've never really talked about this specific topic with my friends. Obviously, in a girl group, we'll probably talk about sex and orgasm and things like that. But the orgasm gap is a new thing. So to kind of help our audience to understand this topic, how would you define the orgasm gap?
So the orgasm gap is the consistent finding in the psychological research literature that when cisgender women, so people born with a vagina, people identified as female at birth, have sex with cisgender men, the women are having way fewer orgasms than the men are. So let me highlight this with some statistics, if I might. In one study, 39% of women versus 91% of men said they usually orgasm during a sexual encounter. Now, that study didn't ask the type of sex, but there's been a lot of studies since then. And what we find is the gap is largest in first time hookup sex. Like one study found 55% of men versus 10% of women. It gets smaller in subsequent hookups, gets smaller in friends with benefits. It gets the smallest in relationships, but it never closes altogether. That even in relationships, for example, one study found that 85% of men versus 65% of women said they had an orgasm at their last instance of relationship sex. Now, I might be going beyond your question, but some people will say it's because women's orgasms are difficult or elusive. Our bodies are hard. Two other gaps make it clear this is a cultural problem, not a body problem. When women are alone, 95% reach orgasm easily and within minutes, 4 minutes to be exact, same amount of time as when men pleasure themselves. And when women have sex with other women, they have more orgasms than with men. The most striking study to date was a study of bisexual women. So women who were hooking up with men and women. So same woman, same body. When they hooked up for the first time with women, they orgasmed for first time hookup sex 64% of the time. Same woman, when they hooked up the first time with men, 7% of the time.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So what does that tell us, right? It tells us that the problem is not our bodies. The problem is, and I'm not blaming men either. I've been married to the same man for 37 years. People think I'm anti-men. I am not. This is not a male problem. This is a cultural problem.
Yep.
This problem is about the way we do heterosexual sex and our cultural ignorance of women's most reliable routes to orgasm.
Mm. Wow, that is a very striking statistic. I'm
Yes.
I'm shook to my core, and yeah, never thought I would hear that because when you say 60 something percent and then you go straight to 7%, I was like, 17? No, 7. I was like,
No,
whoa.
seven.
Yeah,
Seven.
yeah.
Yes.
I thought you were gonna go like 17. No, 7. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a massive gap. So, it's a pretty big deal in the sense that we're talking about well-being, and our sexual well-being, sexual self is very important, and there's a big gap, and we're talking about well-being in general, and I know we're talking about the orgasm gap, so women are more affected. But I wonder if this orgasm gap affects both men and women's well-being.
Absolutely, 100%. And let me say that a correlation in the literature, or even causation, we can say there's been enough studies
Yep.
that sexual health is highly related and predictive of sexual satisfaction, is predictive of relationship satisfaction. Sexual satisfaction is predictive of overall life satisfaction and relationship satisfaction. So we can easily say why. Sure, it would affect women. We're less satisfied, so we might be less life and relationship satisfied. But when we look at the root cause of the orgasm gap, there's so many, but a lot of it is this cultural idea that women should orgasm the same way men do, through intercourse. Very few do without clitoral stimulation. But men are duped by this as much as women. You look at any movie, or, the woman is having a fast and fabulous orgasm from intercourse alone. And so when a man doesn't, quote, give a woman an orgasm that way, he often feels less manly, incompetent. And, there's all these myths about he should have a big penis, he should thrust hard, he should last long. And there's even been studies that show that men's sense of self-worth is related to, quote, making a woman orgasm. And so, they're struggling with this as well. And the truth would set everybody free.
Yeah. Wow, that is so eye-opening. And I think it's great to acknowledge both sides of the story, right? Because earlier you were saying a lot of people think you're men haters, and you're definitely not. And I think that is so true. It's kind of similar to the fact that we talk about feminism, not because we hate men, but because we just want equality. It should just work for both sides. So you said we should know the truth, and the truth will set us free. What is that truth? And, the question is definitely surrounded around societal norms and societal factors that affect us. And you did mention that before. This is something that has been ingrained in our heads, in our brains for so long. So what
Yes.
are some of the key issues, and what is the truth?
Okay, there's so many sexual truths we don't know about, but the
Okay.
biggest one that is affecting the orgasm gap. It's not the only one, and I'll talk about a couple others. The idea that Cher Height tried to expose and got run out of town for is that most women do not orgasm from intercourse alone. Now, if anybody's listening to this and you're a woman who does orgasm that way, I am not intending to make you feel bad at all. Because what I want to say is, however you experience pleasure and orgasm is fine. It's perfect. But the reason I'm focusing here is because we know that depending on the way the question is worded or the study, only 18%, about anywhere from 25 to 18% of women orgasm from thrusting alone. And in research I've conducted, only 4% of women say thrusting alone is their most reliable route to orgasm. 4%. The other 96 need clitoral stimulation, either alone or coupled with penetration. The clitoris, not the vagina, is the equivalent of the penis. And yet, think about how deeply ingrained this is in our culture. We call women's entire genitals a vagina. That's one part. It's the part where penises go in, babies come out. We're erasing the part of ourselves that give us the most pleasure when we use that word. We use the word sex and intercourse as if they were one and the same, when intercourse is men's, not women's, most reliable route to orgasm. We use the word foreplay, just a lead up. to the main event instead of it being considered equally sex. So I think I got off and lost your question. I must say, I get a little passionate and I lost
No,
your
I love
question.
it. No, you did lose the question a little bit, but I love that you just said that you address one of the biggest truths that we don't talk about. My question was more about the societal norms and social cultural factors. So it's more on the bigger scale. But we're talking about something that is actually quite important because we don't know about this or we don't address this. It's a pretty big misconception that everyone has, I would say.
Right. So the misconception that the women should orgasm from intercourse or it's the ideal type. So that's one.
Yeah.
Another misconception that contributes to this is that, and Emily Nagoski talks about this in her book, Come As You Are, a lot, that if we're excited, we'll be lubricated. If we're lubricated, it means we're excited. Women have something called arousal non-concordance. Our brains might feel interested, our genitals don't, or vice versa. So the idea that we should lubricate, many women don't lubricate naturally, and store-bought lube is your best friend sexually, especially for penetrative activities. Another misconception, oh, this I could talk about for hours, is that vibrators replace men, they're addictive, they desensitize your clitoris. None of that is true. They are not addictive. I mean, do carpenters get addicted to power tools? No, they just get the job done faster. They don't desensitize your clit. In fact, there's some research, they make you more sensitive. They don't replace men, they don't cuddle, they don't kiss. And even the fact we call them sex toys, there was an article that just came out in a medical journal saying we need to call these medical devices
Mm.
because they are empirically supported. Many women, especially older women, but many women, women with diabetes, women in general, many women don't orgasm unless they use a vibrator. And why is that? We actually have these things called Pacinian corpuscles on our skin. They respond to vibration. Our genitals are full of them, penises and vulvas. So oh, I could go on and on about misconceptions, but let me stop there.
No, we're going great. I think those are really, really good things to address because I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about the societal norms and social cultural factors that contribute to this disparity, in which we call the orgasm gap, it's because of those misconceptions that don't get stopped from spreading
Yes,
or
exactly.
addressed. And I think I talked to a guest not long ago about our sexual self and sexual empowerment. And one of the biggest things that we talked about back then, and I think it applies to this conversation too, is how we do sexual education. And,
Mm,
also you said, like movies portray things like this, books portray things like that. And a lot of people watch porn. That might be another thing that, just makes all of this even more complicated and cause even more misconceptions. So what would be some of the societal solutions that we can do to
yes.
address this gap?
Well, first of all, sex education is the number one. Um, we have a terrible sex education system. We tell young people, don't have sex, you'll get pregnant and die and get diseases. And if we do give sex education, we don't talk about consent. We don't talk about pleasure. It's like it's a secret in sex ed that sex is pleasurable. And we certainly don't talk about the clitoris. As Peggy Orenstein said in her book, Girls and Sex, the boys are taken in one room and they're told about ejaculation. The girls are taken in another and told about their periods. Those are different things. One's sexual, one is not. It's like the clitoris doesn't even exist. And you mentioned porn. I think porn is here to stay, and we could get into the research on if it's helpful, it's harmful. The one thing we know about porn that is harmful is when people use it as sex education. And in the absence of scientifically accurate sex positive sex ed, our young people are getting their sex education from porn. And when I teach my class, I do these anonymous polls. I ask them questions they can answer. In my last class, about 43% of women and 54% of men said that they had assumed what they saw in porn was real and attempted to mimic it in real
Oh,
sex.
wow. That's crazy.
Yes.
That's insane.
Yes. And some of the things we see in porn would be very, very harmful and are harmful in real sex. And my students tell me stories. A big one that's going on right now, there's a lot of choking that goes on in porn,
Oh my
strangulation.
gosh.
And I've had almost 70% of my students tell me that a man had tried to do that with them without consent because they saw it in porn, or pulled their hair or been rough with them. And I'm not saying that there aren't people that don't enjoy those activities, but
Yeah,
those activities need discussion and conversation and consent and negotiated boundaries. So in my
totally.
ideal world, we would have sex ed that would also include porn literacy. We
Mm.
don't put people in front of a TV to learn to drive and have them watch a Fast and Furious movie, but that's what we're doing with sex.
Yeah. I love that analogy. I love Fast and Furious. I love anything to do with cars. And you said that. I'm like, yeah, that's so funny. I love that. I think it's so true because, I remember, and for context, I have to say this every time I'm on the show because, the show is in Australia. It might be, there might be a misconception that I'm Australian. I'm not. I'm from Vietnam. And where I was born, sex ed is this thing where kids would get together in a really big hall. There'll be a projector or two, and then there'll be condoms flying around, like here you go, take them home. And everyone will start laughing about whatever is getting taught. It's not serious. It's not scientific enough. And also, they don't ever talk about why. Why are we talking about these things? Why do we need to know about it? It never started there. It's just like, okay, here's something that's super uncomfortable, but let's talk about it.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
no context, no
Mhm.
seriousness.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Netherlands, I don't know if you know much about their sex ed, but it starts in kindergarten.
Oh,
It goes
wow.
all the way through high school. It's kind of like math, right? You learn 1 + 1 = 2 in
Yeah.
first grade, and maybe by, your senior year, you're doing algebra. And they
Yeah.
treat their sex ed like that. They label the body parts, including the clitoris, in, kindergarten. And there's also research that if you teach children actual names, they'll be more likely to report sexual abuse if it occurs.
Yep.
And then by high school, they're talking about orgasm, consent, pleasure. Like
Yeah.
it gets increasingly sophisticated. And guess what? They have the way smaller orgasm gap.
Hmm. Consent is such an important thing. And yeah, we don't talk about that enough. I only started noticing that when I was in Australia. So, my first year here, I remember going to my uni and the different unis, and there's a sticker going around. It's consent matters. And, for the first time in my life, I started to understand what that means in actuality and how important it is because we don't talk about it in Vietnam.
Hmm.
I don't know about the educational system right now because it's been so long since I last went to school. But yeah, schools, we never talked about it. When I went to uni doing my undergrad almost 10 years ago, we never talked about it either. So it's pretty insane.
Yeah,
it's
it is.
Yeah, it's pretty sad too. So I think the solution is great, but it doesn't start with us only, I guess, in this sense, because educate the education system. I don't know how to even start talking about that. It's a big topic in itself. But what I do know is we can start talking about this more with, our people, our circles, our friends, family. I know for a fact that my family doesn't talk about it at all because to them it's like, oh, we don't talk about sex in this household. It's awkward. It's taboo.
Right. Right. So I do think
Okay.
sex ed is the solution, but I'm sad to say I don't think we're going to get there in our lifetime. So I agree with you. I think it's up to us. So how do we do that? Next time you're with a group of your friends, or anyone listening, and you see a movie and the woman's having this fast and fabulous orgasm from intercourse alone before they have any conversation, no consent, say something. Say, that's really unrealistic. Like, let's talk about this. Like, start talking about it as if calling out these false images and talking, and then as if and when people who are aware of this become parents, change it with your own children. So,
Yeah.
we don't, if we wait around for sex ed, these problems will never change. So I agree with you. It's really important to just have conversations, which is why I'm so glad you're invited me to have this conversation.
Yeah. Well, at least you've enlightened one person, two people today. Myself and Aiden in the studio. We're listening attentively. Yeah, I think it's a great topic to talk about. Never got this education before, so now I'm directly getting this from you, and hopefully our audience would learn at least a new thing or two from today. I think another thing is, the fact that we're not talking about it enough, but also the self-education, because one of the things that we mentioned briefly earlier was how a lot of people are experiencing, being choked without consent and things like that, because these men watch porn and they just apply that straight away without, any thinking. And I think the self-awareness part is important here, because we cannot change if we don't want to change.
Right.
Genuinely. So, in the sense of self-education, where do you think we can start? I know this is not on the agenda, but I'm really curious to know.
Well, I think people have to know that if both parties aren't consenting, if both parties aren't enjoying themselves, then it's not a good experience. And so there's so many resources out there, for women and men to educate themselves. There's some terrible people, right, on TikTok and Instagram telling lies, but follow really true educated sex positive people. Read books. I'm going to tell you, my book Becoming Cliterate has a chapter written just for men, and the rest, it summarizes all this written for men, and most of it's written for women. And I talked about bibliotherapy earlier. There was a study published in a scientific journal showing that women who read my book have more orgasms, better body image, better communication, less sexual pain, more pleasure. And men who read it become better communicators, more clear about women's pleasure, and they feel better about themselves too. So if you're hearing this conversation, and my book's not the only one, it's just the only one I know about research on, right? And too many books are out there without research, but educate yourself. Ian Kerner has a great book called She Comes First. Now, it's more of an oral sex how-to manual, but it gives very good information. Emily Nagoski's books, like there's great books out there written by sexologists. Get them, read them, do your homework, educate yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think we should definitely think about this more and read more on this topic, because I know for a fact that I don't, personally. So I have to admit, I'm going to have to read more on this topic. It's kind of scary sometimes as well, because you're like, oh, I'm going to face the truth. Oh my gosh, it's going to be scary. But yeah, very important.
I think if we could reframe that as it's even scarier to operate on false assumptions.
Exactly. I know
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. It's so easy to think, in black and white, right? It's just like, oh, that's scary. But actually,
Right.
no, it's not. It's
It's
like you said.
empowering.
Yeah, like you said, it's empowering, and it's important for you to know, because how are you supposed to do life without knowing all this stuff? Well, you can figure it out on the go, but chances are you're going to, make some assumptions along the way, and that's not going to be helpful. So it's better to educate ourselves.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Going back to that Fast and Furious metaphor, I mean, if we all learned to drive like that, there'd be a lot of fatalities, right? And that's what we're doing with sex. There are sexual fatalities happening, bad sex, and because we're educating ourselves with entertainment instead of science.
Mm. I really love that. That's exactly why our shows are about. We have I know this is off topic, but we have all these shows, especially well-being science. We invite experts like you because we want to really delve into the science side of it. And we can make the conversation fun so it's easier for our audience to understand. But at the end of the day, we have to face the truth. And a lot of that is the hard things that you've been talking about. And I really adore you for doing the work that you're doing because not a lot of people, show up and talk about sex education the way that you do.
Oh,
Just
thank you.
very honest to the point. I really love it. Just want to say that. But one of the other things I want to ask is the psychological factors that can, influence orgasm and pleasure. And this probably applies to both men and women.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder what they are, how they can differ between men and women, or, even in other genders, because we have a wide spectrum of genders nowadays. And let's try to be as inclusive as we can.
Yes, and I appreciate that. And I do want to say that when I talk about the orgasm gap, I use the terms women and men broadly because that's where the research is. We don't yet know like what's happening. There's not enough research to know what happens when a, non-binary person is getting it on with a cisgender person or another non-binary person. So that's why I've been talking in the binary, but you know, um, I really appreciate you bringing that up. So, psychological factors that come up are body image issues, and this affects women, men, non binary folks, trans individuals, especially sometimes when there's gender dysphoria. But the bottom line is, it is absolutely impossible to experience sexual pleasure when we're in our head focused on, ooh, do I look okay? Do I smell okay? I don't like this body part. You to have an orgasm requires focusing, immersing in your body. And I can tell you it is impossible to orgasm while you're holding your stomach in. I literally wasted 4 years of college trying. It doesn't happen. If you're sitting there thinking, how do I look? You're not going to have an orgasm. And women have a lot of body concerns. People with penises think it's too small, etc. So that cuts across everybody. And we're also seeing an upsurge in genital self-consciousness among people with vulvas, thinking like their lips are too big. I want to tell people it's completely normal to have one inner lip stick out from the outside, or one bigger than the other. Also, general distractions. Like, I can't tell you how many people are in the middle of sex and be like, oh, I forgot to answer that email. Like, I forgot to, do this or that. Like, it's the same thing, whether you're focused on a task you forgot to do or how your body looks bad, you're not going to orgasm. So getting out of your head and into your body is a real difficult one for most. And the antidote to that is mindfulness, putting your mind and body in the same place. And there's so much research about the benefits of mindfulness. But one that doesn't get talked about enough is it's an empirically supported, scientifically supported technique to help with sexual pleasure. And there's a great book called The Better Sex Through Mindfulness by Laurie Mintz. She's the one who's responsible for taking mindfulness and applying it to the sexual realm. So that's a big one, being in your head. Another is like self shame and self evaluation, like slut shaming, thinking, you're having sex too early, or, that kind of thing. Or for those people raised in purity culture, that can really wreak havoc. So there's many: depression, anxiety, lack of sleep. All of those things are going to impact sexual wellness.
Wow. So many things we didn't think about. I was kind of laughing when you said, oh, I haven't answered that email in the middle of sex. I was like, yep, I'm sure that happens.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that, we have, and that, and some people are too anxious. They can't really do mindfulness. So fantasy is another way to get out of your head. And there's also misconceptions about fantasy. Like, people are so ashamed of their sexual fantasies. But there was a great book by Justin Lee Miller called Tell Me What You Want. He studied thousands of people. And guess what? Most of us have pretty similar fantasies. And fantasy is different than reality.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so important that couples, regardless of their genders, and this is me trying to be as inclusive as possible, understand what you just talked about, because there are so many different factors. And sometimes it's not about the other person involved. It's because you're in your head, right? So what I'm trying to say is, when it comes to sexual pleasure, it's both people. But then when a person is kind of off, the other person can start thinking, oh, is it because of me? But then maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually just the other person. They're dealing with stuff of their own. And that's why it's so important that they communicate better and understand this. So both need to understand the perspectives of what might happen and what can happen. But at the same time, they need to communicate. However, it's kind of hard. So
Yes.
how should couples go about communicating about this topic?
Yeah, I'm fond of saying something that a client once said to me after I taught her communication skills. She said, communication is the bedrock to make your bed rock.
Oh,
Um,
I love that.
yeah. And honestly, what you're bringing up is why I have an entire chapter on communication in both of my books, is because you need, first of all, sexual communication is just a subset of good general communication. So the first step is learning to communicate well about your general needs. What are they? Get in touch with yourself, be able to say them with statements. I want, I need. Don't ask questions that aren't really questions. Like, do you ever ask someone, like, where do you want to go to dinner? They say a place, and then you're like, no, not that, because it wasn't really a question. It was a statement. I want this. And even the question, do you want to have sex? It's never a question. The other person's never just curious. They either want to or they hope you don't want to because they don't. Right? So then we need to learn to communicate outside of the bedroom. I call them kitchen table sex talks. You talk about it outside of sex. Sex therapists say don't solve problems in the bedroom.
Mm,
Talk about sex before sex. Get
yep.
consent. Talk about what you're going to do. Talk during sex. You can communicate verbally and non-verbally during sex. And then talking after. How was that for you? Could it have been better? Like, how could it have been better? So sexual communication should be interwoven through one's life, and people don't know this.
Wow, that is so interesting. I love that because, yeah, I do know for a fact that it's extremely hard to be vulnerable and talk about things in the bedroom, even outside the bedroom, right? And this applies to all of us. I mean, maybe some people are more comfortable because of the way that they were brought up, because of, the experience that they've had in life so far. But I think for most of us, it's still sort of awkward to talk about. I don't know about you, Laurie, but we'll talk about the practice part where we get some tips from you specifically. But I guess it's just a matter of understanding the gap is there, and we don't talk about the causes enough. And so I think once we start having these conversations about what actually happens and why the gaps is there, we can understand both perspective, because like you said, this applies to both men and women. And of course the term is used loosely because we haven't been able to address other genders. But I would say it's been really enlightening to learn about, like what we can do as a society, what we can do from our own perspective. And I think it starts with self-education. Once again, very important. It starts with talking about it more often with your friends, your family, your circles, especially your partner if you have one. And even if you don't and you just engage in casual sex, it's even more important to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's been really eye-opening for me personally. I have to do a lot more reading on this topic because as I said, I was not educated in this area the way that I would have loved to be educated in. And I know for a fact that a lot of my friends are hesitant to talk about it too. So this opens a door to a lot more
Mm.
conversations, and it'll be amazing. But let's be a bit more practical now. We've covered the theory. We've talked a lot about the whys and the hows. So I want to ask you, and this can be personal, and this can be something you recommend to others. Which practice would you employ to address and bridge this orgasm gap? Could be in your personal life, or could be, with your clients or people you work with.
Well, actually, my book is a combination of cultural analysis. Why do we have the orgasm gap, and self help to empower people with vulvas to orgasm? So I'm going to focus there. Um, the first thing is know what you have. People with penises can hold them, see them when they pee. We need concerted effort. So get a diagram of a vulva and then take a mirror, identify your parts, find your inner lips, find your clitoral hood, know what you have. That's step one. And know that all vulvas are beautiful. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they're all beautiful. Okay. Then the next step is to work on your mind. Work on getting rid of those sex negative, deeply ingrained thoughts like sex is dirty, we don't talk about it, and substitute the thoughts sex is beautiful, let's talk about it. Then work on mindfulness, work on it in daily life, and then apply it to the bedroom. And no, meditation is great, but you don't have to meditate to learn mindfulness. I love the metaphor of a roller coaster. If you've ever been on a roller coaster, when you get on, you might be like, if you're me, like, oh, why did I do this? I hope it doesn't get stuck. Your mind's going bananas. But then when you start flying downhill, you're just in your body. You're screaming, but you're in your body. That's mindfulness. So, how do we practice it in daily life? I challenge everyone the next time you're brushing your teeth, 60 seconds, 30 seconds. Really focus on the feeling of the toothbrush in your mouth, the sensation of the toothpaste. Same with the time you're washing your hands. And know that your mind will wander a billion times. In 30 seconds, it might go vary a lot. But the key is not to have your mind not wander. It's to go, oh, there she goes again. Come on back here. Come back to my body. You can practice mindfulness in your daily life, then apply it to sex. Then the next step is masturbation. Take the time, use your hands, a vibrator, lubricant. Find out what works for you because everybody needs something different. Then the next step is a lot of people stop there. They know what they want, especially people with vulvas, but then they don't go to the next step to transfer that to partner sex. And the most essential step to orgasming with a partner is getting the same type of stimulation we get alone. So many times people with vulvas, they know what to do alone, but they don't they let it go during sex with a partner. So use your communication skills to talk about it, to say what you want, to do it yourself. It's no less sex if you have to touch yourself while the partner is there. So and then let's all change the sexual scripts in terms of heterosexual sex. No more foreplay just to get her ready, intercourse, sex over. Sex is not a staircase where we climb it to a goal. Even though I'm talking about orgasming, the goal-oriented sex is less likely to be pleasurable. So immerse in the sensation, take turns pleasuring one another. That's one of the reasons lesbian sex is more orgasmic.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. So much to practice,
Yeah.
and I think it's going to take some time for all of us to go through this step by step. And for a lot of women, I think this is going to be very empowering because I guess um, not all of us know that we have this power,
Yes,
you know?
exactly. Yes.
Yeah. It took me a lot of research and um, even just watching videos from random women talking about sex to allow me to know, oh, you know what? It's actually very empowering. I don't have to be ashamed to talk about it or experience it myself,
Yes.
And yeah, I think one more thing that I am keen to hear from you is when we have all of these different practices, there will obviously be roadblocks. What are some of the roadblocks we might need to look out for, and how can we address them? And this probably applies specifically to the women because we're talking about them.
Thinking that you're too much. I've had so many women tell me, "Oh, I think it would be pushy to ask for clitoral stimulation." I'm like, "Why?" He's not saying it's pushy to ask for his penis to be stimulated. It's an analogous organ. So you're not too much. You're not pushy. You have a right to find sexual pleasure. That would be something I'd really want to say.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Before we wrap up this topic, is there anything else you would like to share with us? Is there anything that we haven't been able to cover yet?
There is one thing, and it doesn't have to do with the orgasm gap, but it has to do with sex. It has to do with sexual desire. And I think if a lot more people knew this, we'd have a lot happier couples.
Yep.
And that is sex. People think of sexual desire as being horny, right? Like, which is, actually being horny is the beginning of arousal, genital tingling, lubrication, etc. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I was really horny in the beginning of a relationship and then it went away. Something's wrong with me. Something's wrong with the relationship." And in fact, what we know is there's something called the limerence phase. It's the can't keep your hands off of each other, very horny phase of an early relationship. That is normative for that feeling to go away in 6 months to 2 years. And especially under stress, and especially with people who identify as women. And as we age, a lot of us stop feeling horny. We stop feeling spontaneously horny. But what people then they say, "Oh, something's wrong with me, something's wrong with the relationship." They often stop having sex. But what people don't know is there's something called responsive desire, which is I might not be horny, but I'm open in my mind to the idea of sex for a variety of reasons. It'll be good when it gets going. I know I'll sleep better. I know I'll feel, better about my relationship. So a lot of people don't know this. And if they did, what they could do is use their responsive desire to have sexual encounters. And I call it reversing the equation. Have sex to get horny rather than waiting to be horny to have sex, especially in the context of a long-term relationship. And I strongly suggest scheduling sexual encounters. People go, "Oh, that's so unromantic." So don't call it scheduled sex, call it a tryst, a planned meeting between lovers. And then you can use your responsive desire to take you there. And while we've talked about the orgasm gap, and that's a problem, lack of orgasm, that really plagues women and people involved with their whole life, but mostly a lot of it's in the 18 to 35-year-old range. Women 35 and up, their number one concern is low desire. And that was the topic of my first book, A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex. So since we didn't talk about it, I think that the idea of desire and scheduled sex and responsive desire are really important. The last thing I'll say is we need to use that technique. We need to debunk the idea of spontaneous sex, another myth. Most sex is not spontaneous. I often say to my students, when you go out at night to the bar, you take a shower, you put on whatever outfit you think you're cutest in, you do all these things, you flirt all night, and oh my gosh, the night ended in sex. That's not spontaneous, that's well orchestrated. And once people face the fact that it was never spontaneous, it
Yeah.
opens the door to scheduled sex and using responsive desire.
That is such an interesting one. Good one. Thank you. I really love that.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's it. We've wrapped up the topic with on a high note. I think that's a that's a really fun thing to think about. The next time you are thinking, "Oh yeah, I'm not scheduling sex," you are probably doing that, orchestrating it. But let's close with your open mic. I know you're super passionate about this topic. I wouldn't be surprised if you mentioned something else related to the orgasm gap or sex or sexual education. But the floor is yours.
Yeah. Um, this is a completely different topic. So it's not even about sex, but you gave me the open mic. So I hope this is okay, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately is quality, and it relates to well-being, is quality of life, is our right to choose to die. And I know that may offend some people, and I certainly hope not, but I've had some experiences of late with some friends and such who really became too ill and they didn't want to be alive anymore. They were in agony, they were in pain, and there was no way out. At least in the US, and so, I think a lot about this because when our dogs are in agony and we know there's no relief, we take them out of their agony. And, I'll be very personal. My mother died, and she died a long, tortured death. And she asked the doctors, "Can't you end this?" And they said no. And so, and so that's something that I've been passionate about and thinking about a lot lately, is why can't we sometimes treat people with the dignity we treat our animals when they're suffering very deeply, and there's no the end is near anyway.
Yeah, I think that is definitely another big topic in itself. And one of the books that I read not long ago, I think it's a series Me Before You book. I'm not sure if our audience is familiar with that, but yeah, it talks about that because the main character suffered so much that he just wanted to end his life, and it obviously really hurt the people around him, but everyone understood that it was for the best because he was in agony every single day and he was not himself anymore. So I think you're right. It's a matter of choice and allowing people to choose what they would like, especially when it's towards the end of their journey and they feel like there's just no more to that journey. And
There's
it
no
could
more
be
well-being.
there's no more well-being. It could be at the beginning of something else, and it could actually it definitely would hurt the people around them at that particular period, but moving forward it might actually help to
Exactly.
release both themselves and others. So yeah. Well, I think it's not a high note to end with,
Sorry.
but no, not at all. But I think it's an important thing to address when it comes to well-being, and I'm glad you have brought this up today because we haven't talked about it before on this show. So thank you for relating your open mic with well-being, and I think that's a beautiful thing, even though it's not the happiest of things to talk about. But I think it's important that we talk about it. So thank you for being
Thank
here
you.
and talking about everything that we've talked about, all the tough topics. And I just love that you're able to talk about all these tough topics. You're an empowering woman for us. And I hope our audience enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed learning from you.
Well, I enjoyed it too. Thank you for the honor of being here.
You've been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast, produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.